Sew and Go Separates is a topic for this mini-series on Sewing with Nancy. Thanks for joining me. I'll start by giving you hints on sewing an old standby, a pullover top, but this time with an updated crossover neckline. Once you know the basics, I'll show you how to expand this pattern, changing it into a short or long dress with 2 additional collar options. It's the perfect pattern to sew and then go to work or for leisure. Discover the joy of sewing separates next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's how-to sewing program with Nancy Zieman is brought to you by PFAFF, the largest European producer of sewing machines. PFAFF's creative line of sewing machines and hobby lock sergers are simply the best. Ginger, a tradition of quality scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. Madeira's superior quality threads from Germany, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effects threads, because creativity is never black and white. Prim Dritz, the source for sewing and quilting notions, including products by Dritz, Collins, and OmniGrid. Amazing designs by Great Notions, your one source for home embroidery. Over 200 disc pack collections currently available, including designs by Nancy Zieman. Koala cabinets from Australia, quality crafted, fully assembled sewing furniture designed for maximum storage in minimum space. And Nancy's Notions catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and unique hard-to-find sewing notions and supplies.
I'd like to begin by showing you the basic sewing techniques of this pullover top. The pattern is very simple. The detail is in the neckline. Here we have the rib collar, then I'm going to show you a hood as well as a button-up collar neckline treatment. To accommodate that unique treatment at the neckline, the pattern front is shaped with an inner corner, and I'll show you the details of working with this. The other main pattern pieces are the back and the sleeves. Very simple sewing, very simple styling. The ribbing for this particular pattern needs to be 4.5 inches wide, and for a size medium, the 4.5 by 24 is the size of the ribbing. You fold it in half, meeting the wrong sides, then fold the length so that you can mark the center back, and then place a pin at each end 5/8 of an inch from the cut edge. This pattern requires 5/8 or has 5/8 of an inch seam allowances. It works out best for the construction of the neckline, but in the seams itself you really don't need all that 5/8 of an inch amount. So to work with the seam allowances, here are 2 guidelines. Serge the seam, serging with the needle at the 5/8, and the serger blades will trim off the excess seam allowances. For those of you using a traditional sewing machine, simply stitch at the 5/8 of an inch, trim, and then zigzag with a wide zigzag so that the seam of the knit fabric has a slight amount of stretch. When working with the pattern piece, there are just a few construction tips that I'd like to pass along right now. The shoulder seam you would serge or sew as I indicated, but I like to serge or sew over clear elastic to allow the shoulder seam to have give. When you're taking the top off, putting it back on, then it goes back to its original size. So just serge or sew over the elastic. To work with the neckline, because we have the corners, inside corners, we're going to stay stitch. And this stitching has been highlighted with a marker. Just stitching at the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to give that seam a little extra support. You'll see how I work with that a little bit later. Find the center back of the collar and the center back of the garment and pin the 2 together, which I have done here, meeting right sides. And pin all the way around the neckline, and then pin matching that 5/8 of an inch pin to the lower edge of the square neckline. Then on the opposite side, do the same pinning. Overlap the fabric, the ribbing fabric, meeting the cut edges, meeting that 5/8 of an inch stitching line, and pin. The objective is that the pin and that blue mark that I placed are lining up. The rest of the neckline is going to be almost at a 1-to-1 ratio. And if you have a little extra fabric, little extra of the garment fabric, put that extra in the back so it fits snugly. And now I'll show you how to stitch the neckline. I took a little extra time to do some additional pinning of the ribbing to the neckline. The ribbing is cut 1 inch shorter than the neckline of the garment, and I have the garment being 1 inch longer in the back, so I just have the ribbing stretched to meet the back so that it hugs around the neckline. The rest of the ribbing is pinned at a 1-to-1 ratio to the garment. I'm going to start to sew at the lower edge at one corner, placing my needle in the fabric exactly where the stay stitch marking is and where I have the pin mark. This is probably the most important part of creating this project, is to get the marking just where you'd like it and to start at that corner. So take a little extra time to put the needle at the pin mark. As I'm stitching, I'm going to be stitching at the 5/8 of an inch stitching line because the pattern has 5/8 of an inch seam allowances, even though I'm working with knit fabrics. For this top, you may want to consider using an interlock knit, a Lacoste knit, or a Ponte knit. Right now we're working with a Lacoste. It has kind of a waffle weave effect to it, and it's a very sporty looking type of interlock. And we'll just stitch around the neckline. Now I'm at the back area where the ribbing is a little bit shorter than the garment, so I'm going to stretch the ribbing to meet the garment. And I'll just keep taking out my pins so I don't sew over the pins, and now I'm on the home stretch, the area of the front of the neckline. And now I'll stop sewing again at the corner, the opposite corner of the collar. Now to get at the right spot, I'm going to slightly shorten my stitch length so that I end right at the pin mark, put the needle in the fabric, and then maybe back stitch 1 or 2 stitches just to make certain that I have stopped at the right spot. And we'll see. Sometimes you may overshoot or undershoot your stitching, and the time will tell when you pull up your fabric. Now as I'm bringing this up, we'll check this out, and I've stopped sewing right at the marking on one side, and yes, I did it on the other. So to do the next step, I'll flip it to the inside and cut to the stay stitching marks, cut to the corners. This is why you need that stay stitching area there, so that you do not ravel the fabric. Now I'm going to meet the ribbing ends so that they're crossing over one another. They're crossing over the seam allowance width, and I'll pin. Then this little extra extension from the garment is going to again be meeting these cut edges. So you have this V-shaped marking at both ends. Now I have highlighted my stay stitching, which you would not be doing on your fabric. You would have that looking very nice, and you would not see that, you just see the stitching. And I'll stitch across the lower bottom edge of this collar area, and we'll see how good I can get this on my first try. It's a little bit easier to do this topic when you're not talking, but we'll see how I'm getting all these collars to meet. Let's just 1 minute. I need to pull one collar a little bit longer. There we go. And you may again want to do a basting stitch across this lower edge just in case you have to take it out. And as I pull this up, I'm quite lucky because things are meeting quite well. You can see how one is overlapping on the other, and you may want to do a reinforcement stitch across this lower edge. After getting the collar just the way you'd like it, then you may want to trim your seam allowances around the neckline, trimming them down further, and use a double needle and stitch the seam allowances to the garment. The double needle has 2 needles on one shaft, as we have on this contrasting sample, and it allows the neckline to have some stretch, but yet finishes the neckline perfectly. I rarely sew anything the same way twice, which prompted me to base a program on how easily a pattern can be slightly changed for variety. The classic sew and go pullover can be quickly changed into a short dress with a hood or a longer dress, just with a few strokes of a pencil alongside of a straight edge. Here's how. When you're changing a pattern, you just need some tissue paper, a pen, a straight edge, and a little imagination. We're going to be making the same changes to the front and the back pullover pattern pieces. I'll show you the front piece right here. I've outlined the pattern on tracing paper, just tracing the cut line, the cutting line of the pattern. And then extend the center front line, the long straight front line or back line when working with the back pattern piece, approximately 30 inches, making it much longer. For the side seam, you're going to continue the A-line style of this pullover. And so that you get the right pitch, what I'm going to recommend is that if you align the ruler so that the last 4 inches of the first line are then extended down, continue down, again that same length, approximately 30 inches. You can see we've already made the markings on this particular pattern piece, but to show you how to go about the process, I'll give you the quick steps. To make a short dress from this pullover length, we're going to extend the length 12 inches. And I'm going to use a pin first of all. I find that a little bit more convenient. Just make a pin mark in the tissue paper every couple of inches. Then later on you can connect the dots. As you can see we've done here. You want to make sure that you get the same curve as the original pattern piece. And then draw in the line. To get the correct curve for the hemline of a long dress, again align the ruler, but this time add 14 inches. Now depending upon your height, you may want to add less or a little bit more. But we found 14 inches is about the right length. And then again, do the same tracing or connecting of the dots after you made the marks on your tissue paper. And again, repeat this on your back pattern piece. Now I'd like to show you how you can use these length changes to give variety to your pattern. I'll show you how to add a hood to the neckline. With a simple pattern change, the neckline of the Sew and Go pullover converts to a hood. Add that casual feature to the short dress length version of the pattern and you have a comfortable yet go-anywhere dress that sews as easily as the pullover top. Let's take a closer look at the neckline of this short dress. The model was wearing this dress with a vest, and we'll detail the vest in the 3rd program of this series, but right now let's just concentrate on the crossed over hood section. It has the same construction ideas as the rib neckline, but it looks a lot different just because the pattern is shaped a lot differently. Once you know how to do this construction area, the assembly area, you can sew a variety of pattern changes. In the companion book and the pattern that go with this series, this is the hood pattern. You'll be cutting 2 pattern pieces and sewing together along the hood section. You may wonder, how is this going to fit into that neckline? Well, I just am going to compare it to half of the ribbing. Here's half of the ribbing that we just put in, and it's the same length as the original ribbing that we worked with, even though the shape is slightly different. To finish the front area so that the edge has a finish, we've pressed under 1 inch and used a double needle, or you could use a cover stitch on your serger to stitch the knit into place. We're using an interlock knit, a drapey fabric for this technique. Comparable to what we did earlier with the neckline of the crossed over rib section, I have stay stitched in this area and highlighted it with a blue pen so that you could see the stitching, and then simply align the hood, even though it's a much different shape, but align the hood with the neckline using the same principles I just showed you. I have a 5/8 of an inch mark penned in, or with a marking pen on my fabric, and I would use that as my starting point so that both sides are marked clearly. And then I would pin the rest of the hood to fit the neckline and sew with a 5/8 of an inch seam, the same seaming technique. My life is in samples. I have samples practically of everything, and here you can see we have already stitched the neckline, stitching from point to point. The next step is to do some trimming, or clipping I should say, not trimming, but clipping to the point of the stay stitching. And you can see how the stay stitching got its name. It just keeps the fabric in place from stretching out. And you want to clip to the stitching but not beyond it. Now that little extension is there, and now we simply cross over the hood pieces, one on top of the other. And they are cut just the right length so they fit into that extension. And we would match all the cut edges and then sew across the lower edge. Again, you may want to baste it at first because it sometimes needs a little extra help. And then after you have the right meat, then you can simply double needle or cover stitch around the neckline and you have a nice variation. This button-up collar dress will take you everywhere you need to go. Again, use the Sew and Go pullover pattern, change the length, and add the 3rd option to the neckline. It looks great alone, or accessorized, but best yet, it can be created with a minimum of time and a maximum of ease. You might guess that the lower portion of this collar is created in the same way that we created the rib as well as the hooded collar, using the same technique in this lower edge, but notice the different look. Just by a few changes of the pattern, we have a button-up collar, and I'm going to show you the technique of putting this together, plus a few hints of putting buttonholes into knit fabrics. We're using a Lacoste knit, Ponte knit, interlock, whatever weight you'd like. You'd want something drapey though because of the long line of this A-line dress. For the collar piece, it has the same neckline shape as the hood, identically, but the front is much different. You're going to be cutting two collar shapes on the fold of the fabric. And here you can see I have the two pattern pieces cut on the fold, and when I open this up, you'll see that there's a strip of interfacing, fusible interfacing, pressed about 1 inch wide down the center fold. You do this on both sides of the collar, on both collar pieces I should say, to give support to the buttons and the buttonholes. The seams are the center back seams, and we're going to meet these collars, meeting the right sides. So right sides are sandwiched together, and you'd pin what will end up being the center back seams, so one seam as well as the other. And on this next sample, the seam has been stitched. This is kind of a magical collar because it certainly doesn't look like a collar right here. But if we pin together or pinch together the fold lines, you'll see how the collar then becomes, or you get the shape of the collar. You'd need to press the seam allowances open, maybe do some grading, trim them a little bit, and then stitch the top edge of the collar. And then you'll have your fabric or your collar shaped after you turn this right side out. This next sample shows the collar turned right side out, and I have the lower edge kind of pinned together so you can get the idea how this has been shaped. I'll unpin it, and then you'll even get to see it a little bit more. The important part now is to put in the buttonholes. I like to put the buttonholes in before attaching it to the dress because then you don't have to work with all that weight. On the right front, I have transferred the markings of the buttonholes, 5 little dots with a blue marking pen at the points of the top of the buttonholes. Now if you're able to use a stretch buttonhole stitch, set your machine for that right now. Most knits do have greatest amount of stretch in the length, or excuse me, in the width, and are more stable in the length. So we would like to put the buttonholes lengthwise direction to give them stability. I've already taken some time to do a test buttonhole to see the appropriate length, and I'm simply going to stitch this buttonhole into place. Now I'm using a slightly contrasting thread color, so it's not the blended thread color that you would normally use, but you'll be able to see it more clearly. Because there are 5 buttonholes down the front of this area, the buttonholes are small. You really would not like large buttonholes in this area. So I want to give you some hints about cutting and preparing those buttonholes. By the way, if on your test buttonhole you find that your fabric is not feeding through your machine, place a layer of a lightweight stabilizer on the top, like a wash-away type or an Avalon stabilizer on the top, so that it glides more smoothly. You can see this tiny little button hole. And many times the button cutters are as that size or even larger than the buttonhole. What I'd like you to do is do the cutting of the buttonhole in 2 steps. I'm going to simply just place this down on my table, but instead of putting the fabric flat on top of the wooden cutter, I'm going to put half of the buttonhole on the cutter, and then cut half of the buttonhole. Flip it around and then cut the other half. This way the blade, as you can see, cannot cut through all the layers. So after stitching and then cutting through all the buttonholes, you can attach the collar to the dress using the same techniques I detailed earlier. The Sew and Go separates pattern can be made as a pullover, a short dress or long dress, or a rib collar, a hooded collar, or a button-up collar. The choice is yours how you'd like to combine the various necklines and hemlines because you're the designer or the creator. At home and at my studio, I sew with koala cabinets because of their perfect design. There's no waste of time in getting started. Because of the koala soft touch airlift system, the machine quickly and gently raises to the perfect sewing position. The design allows me to sit directly in front of the needle in clear view of my work with no strain on my neck or back. And koala has a place for all my favorite notions and supplies. I always feel more efficient and more motivated to do my best work when my space is organized. A perfect design, that's why I sew with koala. Here's a hint from Ginger. When I'm adding a decorative touch to a project and I need to trim really close to decorative edge stitching, an applique scissors makes that job easy. The curved handle ensures a comfortable hand position and eliminates stress on my hand and wrist, while the large bill efficiently lifts the fabric I want to trim away. I also use my applique scissors when I'm doing reverse applique, for trimming fabric from behind lace, for grading seams, and to trim quilt batting. An applique scissors is the right tool for trimming away anytime, anywhere. Here's a hint from Madeira. Machine embroidery is a great way to personalize garments and home decor. When I do machine embroidery on garments for my sons or for the home, I want the thread that can stand up to the rigors of high-speed stitching, as well as the challenge of repeated laundering. The new color-fast polyneon thread fits both criteria. I'm especially pleased with the continued brilliance of polyneon, even after repeated exposure to sunlight, chlorine, and machine washing. This 40-weight polyester filament thread also is extremely strong, so it resists abrasion and breakage. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy. When creating your own wardrobe, you have many options that take so little effort. That's why my staff and I developed this series, Sew and Go Separates. We're in the second program of this three-part series detailing the versatility of a fleece jacket. The pattern is styled for comfort with options for personalization. I'll show you the details of adding accents to fleece, quickly inserting the zipper, and adding the finishing touches of stretch binding. That's what's next on Sewing with Nancy. If you've never worked with high-loft fleeces such as polar fleece or Eskimo fleece, this is a perfect opportunity to give it a try. I'm going to be showing you some creative steps by adding, for example, diamond-shaped appliques, as well as the functional steps of adding the stretch binding and inserting the zipper. We're going to start with some basic seam ideas. High-loft fleeces really require very minimal sewing techniques. Straight stitches are perfect. A 5/8 of an inch stitch, straight stitch, is really all you need in many times. Because the fabric is very lofty, pressing it the traditional way just doesn't work. You'd flatten the nap. Finger pressing is what works many of the times. And if you really need to steam a seam, use the steam technique, not press the seam. Just by pressing, having the iron over the fabric, allowing it to have the moisture from the steaming iron, and then pat it with your fingers. And that's all you need to do for pressing. Other options to consider for seams would be a serger seam, a 3/4 thread serger, meaning 2 threads in the needle, a left needle and right needle, and an overlock stitch, which works out extremely well, or a straight stitch followed by a zigzag if you'd like a compressed seam. After doing the straight stitch, trim and then zigzag the edges. Because fleeces have the greatest amount of stretch in the crosswise grain and are very stable in the lengthwise grain, and most seams are in the lengthwise direction, this is a perfect seam choice. So you can see there isn't a lot of detail that you need to know when working with high-loft fleeces. When it comes to embellishment, these fleeces again require very little extra knowledge or extra detail. We've started to add 3 diamond shapes or appliques to the very lower edges of the front shape. We position these before doing any of the sewing. Notice the side seam has been stitched. And to position these, rather than using a fusible web, which you would use in a normal applique, pressing with a web would flatten a nap, I'm simply going to use an adhesive spray and position all appliques before sewing. Now I'm doing that the opposite of what I'm going to be actually recommending that you're doing, but position and then stitch. And what's nice about the adhesive spray, I'm just going to try to get it positioned so it's about 3/8 of an inch from the lower edge, and position, and then you don't have to pin. At the front edge, by the way, we did start the applique 5/8 of an inch from the edge to allow room for the zipper, which you'll see in a little bit. The inside of this jacket, since we've already sewn 3 of these appliques, shows the detail of what the stitch we're going to recommend. You don't need to finish the edges with a heavy satin stitch. This is a blanket stitch. It's straight stitched followed by a straight inward stitch, a side stitch. 3 stitches straight and then like a zigzag. 3 stitches straight, a zigzag. And it really looks very hand done, but obviously it's done by machine. The blanket stitch is set with a length of 2.5 and the width about 3. Do a test at home so that your machine and your taste is reflected in your stitching. I have an open toe foot on my machine, allowing open space so that I can see that as I'm stitching along the edge, really along the tan color, and then the zig goes into the navy blue color. Notice I don't have any pins, just that adhesive spray is holding everything in position. And again, position all appliques first. And I'll be stopping with the needle in the down position and then would do the pivoting. And I'll just pivot this around so you can see that it's really very simple to do this type of applique on a fleece fabric. Make sure all your edges are flat and then continue. So with a little bit of effort, you can apply those appliques extremely easily. After applying all the edges, then the next step on this particular pattern is to apply the binding along the hemline. Usually you think of doing the hem at the end, but because of the zipper application, we're going to do the binding right now. I'm going to change my machine to a straight stitch, and the stretch binding is a remarkable fabric, remarkable trim. Lots of lycra in it, so it stretches a lot. It curls to the wrong side. So I'm going to meet the right side of the binding to the right lower edge of the jacket, right sides meeting. And just pin the binding to the jacket on a 1-to-1 ratio so that it's nice and flat. Later on, I'll be showing you how the binding can finish the sleeve hem and slightly give the hem a cuffed look so that it's encased a little bit or it's tightened. But this instance, we just want the edges bound, the way they do it in ready-to-wear. So we have this 1-to-1 ratio. The machine has been changed to a straight stitch, and I'm going to have about a 3.0 length to the stitch. You could leave your open toe foot on or change to your traditional foot. The choice is really yours. And guide the stitching right along the edge. So that, what I mean to say is to guide the presser foot along the edge of the fabric. It's about 3/8 of an inch seam. You do not want to have it any more than that. And you would just stitch all the way around the lower edge. Very simple seaming. This is a 2-step process to do the hemming technique. And then the next step after stitching that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is to finger press the binding and then wrap it around to the underside. And here's where you'd like to take some little extra time to pin so that the binding wraps nicely to the underside and so that you have an even amount of binding showing at the front side. Now with that same stitch, the same straight stitch, I'm going to stitch in the well of the seam, stitch in the ditch, that funny term we use, stitching right where the 2 fabrics meet. The open toe foot is a nice guide here because you can see very clearly where you should be stitching, and I'm just stitching along the blue and wild rice color line. When I pull this up, this small section, of course you'd be sewing around the entire lower edge of the jacket. You can't really see that seam at all from the right side. From the underside, you can see that the binding has been caught. What a fast and neat way of finishing the jacket edge. If you're with me for the first program of this series, I used a simple pullover top and change the neckline. The neckline, like the top I'm wearing, has a little square lower edge. We're having the same signature mark, the same design detail on the jacket. The pattern piece, the jacket front, has this collar with a square inner corner. The collar pieces have the same inset as we had on the top piece. For the jacket, you're going to cut 4 collars and sew 2 together along the center back seam, and then a second one together along the center back seam, so you have an inner collar and an outer collar. The 2 basic techniques you need to learn when working with fleeces is just how to seam it, which is basically a straight stitch, and then how to bind the edges, if you'd like, with stretch binding. The rest is just different applications of those 2 ideas. To put the collar into this jacket, I'm going to show it to you on a sample. It's just going to be a straight stitch. That inside corner that I showed you earlier has a stay stitching, a 5/8 of an inch stitching at that corner, just to give it some stability. I've darkened it so that you could see it more clearly. On the collar itself, you're going to mark the inner corner, and I've marked it with a black dot. You would be marking it with your washable marking pen dot, but I'll stack these 2 together and would stack both the left corner and right corners together and pin the remainder of the collar around the neckline, just meeting it on a 1-to-1 basis all around the neckline. Magically flip this out, and on the opposite side we've already stitched the collar into place from the dot all the way around to the center back, and you continue then to the opposite center front area. When I kind of fold the fabric forward, you can see that this collar is almost complete except this lower edge section. To do the last stitching, we're going to utilize that stay stitching. In other words, clip to the point or that corner where the fabric has been stitched. Stay stitching is just another term for reinforced stitching. Then magically you can bring the 2 collars to meet. That clipping allows the center fronts to meet, and then notice that V-shaped area that forms because of the clipping. And then simply stitch straight across this edge using your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. This next sample shows the collar that has been stitched, and it's just with 2 rows of stitching of straight stitches. It doesn't take a lot of effort, but has a very tailored look. In the inside, we've done trimming of the seam allowances so we didn't have to work with the bulk, and then you simply finger press the fabric flat. That's all there's to it. The zipper is next. We're going to have the zipper go all the way to the hem, finished at the hem edge and also at the top edge. It's 24 inches long. I have one side of the zipper already sewn into place. I've started by placing the zipper across from the finished edge. Remember the binding at the finished edge, meeting the edge of the zipper to the cut edge of the fabric. And then again all the way up to the top. It's important that the zipper teeth, and I'm going to show you this kind of the silhouette of these zipper teeth, they're rather strong. They're plastic, you can't sew through them. So make certain that you position the top zipper tooth about 5/8 of an inch down from the top edge so that you're not going to sew through it. You'll sew next to it when attaching the binding at the top. Attach the zipper by simply sewing down the center of the zipper tape. Pin, of course, the zipper to the fabric. On the opposite side, you'd of course do the same stitching on the left as on the right side. The remaining collar is then sandwiched or sandwiches the zipper into place. And rather than sewing this right now, I'm just going to pin along my first row stitching so that you can see that with just some very simple guidelines, you can have the zipper almost complete. After this was stitching, assuming this is stitching, the collar would be flipped to the inside. And the zipper would be almost complete, and I'll show you a sample where it is. But what speed that goes together. This next sample is a shorter sample showing the zipper already in place. And the final step would be to top stitch the zipper about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch away from the edge, just 1 row stitching to hold it into place. Now granted, this is a sample. It would have normally a jacket attached to it, but the next step is to finish the top of the collar. You'll see soon on the finished jacket the top of the collar is finished. it would be sewn with binding in the same manner as the lower edge, but with one addition. Since we have a raw edge at the top, we need to wrap the binding to the underside and then sew the binding into place. When you flip this forward, flip the binding forward and wrap it to the underside, and then do the stitching in the ditch, notice that that top edge is nice and neatly finished. You can use the same binding technique to bind the sleeve hemline. You attach the sleeve to the jacket using your favorite technique of sewing or serging the edges, but with the basic knowledge of knowing how to seam with a straight stitch, you can attach the zipper, put on the collar, and with the information of knowing how to bind the edges, sew the top of the collar, the sleeve, and the jacket hem. Whether you're skiing or wish you were skiing, this pullover top variation of our Sew and Go jacket offers another creative option. The styling is similar to the jacket, but the details have changed. Gone are the zipper and the appliqué, new are the cropped length and pullover feature. Plus, this Sew and Go ski top is a terrific palette for embroidery. As I mentioned, the looks are quite different from the jacket to this pullover top. You can be the judge how short or long you'd like to make the top. We've shortened this approximately 6 inches. But the main changes occur at the center front. Rather than having a seam or a zipper down the center front, the fabric was cut on the fold. A simple change, simply on your front collar and jacket piece, fold under the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and place the fabric on the fold, or the pattern on the fold of the fabric. The same happens on the collar. That front seam allowance is pressed under, and now one collar is needed, placed on the fold of the fabric. So you have one collar, that's all that's needed. The sewing techniques are so comparable. You're going to be placing stretch binding at the top of the neckline, at the lower edge, and at the sleeves. And since we have a complete circle, cut the stretch binding 1/2 inch longer than needed and seam it, and then sew it in the same technique that I showed you earlier. But the main detail, or the accent, is the embroidery, and I'll show you that right now. All the designs or embroideries that you're going to put on fleece have to be very simple. And we've chosen some very elegant looking snowflake patterns, a grouping of 3 that are going to be stitched to the collar as well as to the lower sleeve. The hint about working with fleece and embroidery is that you cannot put the fleece fabric into the hoop. You have to usually hoop the fabric, but it would leave an imprint in the fleece because you need such a tight mount. The hint will be to use a stabilizer that has a paper covering, and I've scored with a pinpoint a square on the stabilizer, and now it's simply going to remove that top section, and here we have a sticky fabric. The fleece itself then needs to be positioned on the fabric or on the stabilizer fabric, and I've already determined where I'd like the placement to be, and I'm simply going to move the fleece and kind of pat it down, and it will stay in the hoop with this sticky stabilizer. My machine is already set up to do the embroidery, and I have transferred the design from a disc into the card of my machine, and then I have embroidery thread, rayon thread in the top, and then a pre-wound bobbin, or you could just use a lightweight thread in the bobbin, and then use a machine embroidery needle. Follow your owner's instruction book for working with embroidery and do a test run. I usually like to try that, testing out the sample of the thread, the stabilizer, and all that's needed. But the key is that sew a simple seam. And this isn't really a seam, this is sew a simple design. And I'm just going to let this stitch. And while it's sewing, you can see that even though that there is not the fabric in the hoop, it's staying very still, and that the embroidery is stitching on the top without any worry or concern. Earlier I showed you how to do the appliqué. That was a simple stitch. This is simple as well. This particular design has 3 snowflake motifs that have been compiled together. And when stitching the single layer of the collar, we did first the right side, then mirror imaged the design, then did the left side, and then just with one single motif of the appliqué, just stitched 1 in this section. The same 3 or the same trio of snowflakes were also stitched in the lower edge of the sleeve. We'll let the machine stitch, completing this trio of snowflakes, and I'll be back and show you the completed collar. Off camera, I finished stitching the trio of snowflakes. Now simply peel it from the sticky back stabilizer, reposition the collar to stitch another trio. This great combination added a nice accent to the ski fleece top. Here's a hint from PFAFF. On Sewing with Nancy, you've often seen me use PFAFF's exclusive dual feed. The dual feed helps feed the top and bottom fabric layers under the presser foot at the same rate. I find this especially helpful during machine quilting. The layers of the top, backing, and batting feed through smoothly. My dual feed also simplifies matching plaids as well as stripes. It prevents seams from puckering, particularly on lightweight fabrics such as silk and rayon. Whether you're doing specialty sewing or everyday seaming, PFAFF's dual feed offers a real advantage. Here's a hint from Prim Dritz, the manufacturers of Collins quilting products. When hand quilting, use the patented no-slip hoop with a unique tongue and groove shaping system to keep your quilt layers perfectly taut and stable. Simply place the fabric over the inner hoop. Loosen the outer hoop. Slip the outer hoop over the fabric and tighten the screws. The tongue and groove molding will lock the layers in place. When quilting, the perfect companion is a finger pin cushion. Keep extra threaded needles or pins in this convenient mini pin cushion. The no-slip hoop and finger pin cushion are ideal quilting mates. Here's a hint from Amazing Designs by Great Notions. When looking for a background for your embroidery, consider iron-on transfers. Iron-on transfers from the Amazing Designs Embroideryscape line eliminate the search for the perfect fabric. The iron-on transfers act as a backdrop and let you add the detail with your embroidery. I've created this garden scene with two iron-on transfers, the tree and the cottage, while the embroidery is from the Memories of Home embroidery card. The bird bath, trellis, and inviting garden chairs complete this garden scene. I'm so glad that you could join me. I'm Nancy Zieman. This program concludes my three-part series on Sew and Go separates. So far, I've shown you how to design various looks from an easy sew pattern. Next, I'll show you how to convert the jacket pattern we worked with earlier into various vest styles. The outfit that Kate is wearing features a Sew and Go vest worn over a hooded dress. The pattern pieces can be easily changed, giving you great style, freedom, and fun. Discover the joy of sewing next on Sewing with Nancy. Design and style changes on a pattern are extremely easy once you have the know-how. The know-how of changing a jacket pattern, like I'm wearing, this pattern that we worked with in the second part of our series, to a vest pattern takes a few little changes, especially in the armhole area. In addition to that, we're also going to change or make a pattern change into the neckline, and I'll show you how. On the pattern piece, rather than using the sleeve front and back, you'll just use the front and back pattern pieces. And on a jacket, you need a much wider shoulder seam. The sleeves are set in, but on a vest, it should be narrower. There are templates that you can use that are about 1.5 inches wide that can be placed over the pattern. You can trim away the excess fabric from both the front and the back pattern piece. Simple change. And then, of course, don't cut out the sleeve. The collar on the jacket pattern, as you can see, is a stand-up collar, but we're going to have a rib neckline, kind of a V shape to that neckline. Here are the pattern changes that you need. Purchase about 1/4 yard of ribbing, and this ribbing is cut 4 inches wide by 24 inches long, and you'll find those guidelines along with the pattern that accompanies the program, so 4 by 24. And to do the markings on here, we'll need some critical markings or important markings, and that is to measure, after folding the ribbing in half, meeting the wrong sides, measure 5/8 of an inch from each edge, and you can see I have the little blue marking dot right in that position, and pin, fold the fabrics together. The other marking treatment that I'd like you to mark, in addition to marking the other dot at the other end, is to mark the center back. Just fold that fabric in half, and those pin marks are invaluable for later construction use. So you have the markings at the front, 5/8 of an inch from the corner on each collar, and then the center back. The ribbing also goes around the armhole, and the armhole ribbing size is 2.5 inches wide, two of those 2.5 inches wide by the circumference of the armhole. And here we've cut the ribbing and sewn it with just 1/4 of an inch seam. Actually, this happens to be serged. And so you'll serge this together. We're going to fold it in half later, or we're going to double it later, but right now leave it single. And you can see we have pins marking the center and also the quarter marks to make positioning easier. Now I'll show you how to insert the zipper. This is a simple pattern to work with. We're going to put the zipper in and attach the rib collar in tandem, almost using the same step, same processes. Start by stay stitching, giving the fabric extra stability in the corner where the collar will be attached. That corner needs some stability, stitching 5/8 of an inch from the cut edge, about an inch on either side of the corner. Do this on both sides of the vest front. To prepare to position the zipper, rather than using pins, try some double-sided basting tape. We like this because sometimes pins leave dimples in the fabric and you get a ridge, and also the zipper is a little bit heavier than a lightweight knit. We're using a Lacoste knit, which is a medium weight knit, and we simply place the double-sided tape on the right side of the zipper next to the finished edge. Then remove the paper covering from the tape so that you have a sticky surface, and that's going to act as your pin or pins. Meeting right side of the zipper to the right side of the vest front, I'm starting at the hem area, placing the zipper edge, the finished edge, 5/8 of an inch from the hem or at the hem line, and then I can reposition this to get this just right, position it down, and I'm going to place this down on my table and align the zipper and the cut edge, and we have it pinned. This is a 24-inch separating zipper. It's longer than needed, but it's the closest length that you can purchase to work with this vest. In a few minutes, I'll show you how to shorten the zipper length of this outerwear zipper. Now, an interesting part about working with the zipper, especially outerwear zippers, is that there is a change in the weave, and they did this to help us out so that we can stitch straight. It's about 1/4 of an inch from the finished edge, and it's very slight, but it's right in here. You can see that you can stitch right along that edge. Or you could use a presser foot that's 1/4 of an inch wide, however you'd like to work with it. If you were not able to move the needle on your machine, then put it on a zipper foot. I'm just going to push a button so I get the needle all the way to the left. Then I can align it, my needle right with that little change, and you'll see that up close as you're stitching, and just top stitch the zipper into place. And so, now as I get to the zipper top or stop, zipper pull, what you may find is that you will need to raise the presser foot and advance it out of the way so that you can continue to have a straight seam, and I'm just going to get these edges meeting a little bit better and continue sewing. Nice thing about the tape is that it works like pins. You can remove it and then work with it again. The next step is to fold the zipper out to the right side, and then we're going to attach the shoulder seams, the front and back shoulder seams together, as well as sew the ribbing onto the neckline. Now we're going to sew the ribbing on in a reverse order as we did earlier in this series. Rather than sewing the neckline first and this little lower section last, we're going to sew the lower section last and then the neckline. It will work out better for this particular pattern. That 4-inch ribbing was folded in half, and we're going to meet the fold of the ribbing with the fold of the garment so that those two folds are aligning. And I'm going to slip my pin from the underside because I'm going to be sewing from this underside. And then the little dot that we made, 5/8 of an inch from the cut edges, is going to align with the corner of the stay stitching. So these two marks are the most crucial, and they're not hard to do. We'll just align or stack those two marks one on top of the other, and I'll just double check that I'm getting them aligned. If you mark properly, it really makes the sewing so much easier. I'll put the needle back in the straight position and sew just that short little seam across that lower edge, and I'm going to follow the stay stitching. And as I get to the corner, I'll try to stop with the needle. I'll stop with the needle in the down position. Let me just reverse it and reinforce that little needle or that stitching. Then after clipping your threads, then you simply cut to the corner. Cut not the ribbing, just, well, see if I can get there. There we go. Cut to the stitching and open this out. Let me show you this on a vest sample that has been stitched with a shoulder seam. The whole portion of the vest has been positioned in place. I stitched across the lower edge, then clipped to that stay stitching mark, then simply pinned the collar to meet the neckline. And you can almost flatten out the jacket or the vest front so that you can start to sew at that stay stitching line and go all the way around. When you sew it in this manner, the corner ends up perfectly mitered. The next step is to do the finishing details. In the neckline, you're going to be trimming the seam allowances down to 1/4 of an inch and serging or zigzagging, and then later top stitching. But you'll also have to shorten the zipper, which we've already done on this sample. I'd like to show you how to shorten the outerwear zipper. Now, a traditional zipper, you don't have to worry about shortening because you can simply sew through the zipper teeth and you don't have to worry about the bulk. But the teeth on an outerwear zipper are particularly heavy and need to be trimmed away. You can't cut through them and you can't sew through them. Using a buttonhole cutter and block, I've started to kind of trim away some of the teeth. And you would cut, you wouldn't have to do the whole length, just trim away a portion of it, trimming off the top areas of the teeth. As you can see, we have missing teeth here. And then pry off the extra teeth. You don't want to cut the zipper tape. And you would do this technique all the way down into the seam allowance. So at the stay stitching line, I would again cut off the extra plastic teeth and then pry this off. After doing the prying, then you can cut away the extra tape that's in this area. So we'll just kind of work on this a little bit, but it really works out well with the buttonhole cutter. Never thought I'd use it to shorten a zipper. So keep working on that. And that's pliable, then you can sew through this area. Next, I'd like to show you how to attach the ribbing around the armhole area and then do some creative top stitching. To finish the armhole, you're going to be working with the ribbing that was cut 2 1/4 inches wide and sewn into a circle. Quarter mark the armhole of the vest, meet those quarter marks together, which has been done already on this piece, and stitch together with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance in a circle. Then finger press the seam allowances on the right side toward that armhole and wrap the excess ribbing to the underside so that you have a nice finish. Pin the ribbing so that it is even, so that you have an even width going all the way around the area. One of the ways to finish this would just be to stitch in the ditch, that funny term we use, to stitch in the well of the seam right in between the two fabrics to attach the ribbing from the underside. Another option would be to give it a sportier look with a cover stitch. We've used cover stitches on many of the garments in the Sew and Go Separate series. To show you what that looks like. Around the neckline of the earlier vest, you can see the double needle stitching. Actually, this is not a double needle on a conventional machine or a seam stitched twice, but rather a serge seam. 2 needles, and on the flip side, it's called a cover stitch because you can see all of that thread creating a covered look. Sometimes you may want to use the cover stitch as the right side of the fabric. This time, we would like that double needle stitching on the top. So you can finish around the neckline as we have around this vest, or on the armhole, hem. The choice is yours, wherever you'd like some top stitching to show. My machine is set up according to my owner's guide for a cover stitch. I've chosen to use all-purpose thread in the needles, and since I did not have 2 spools of this thread, I wound a bobbin with this same color of thread. In the looper, you'll need to use serger thread. You don't have to have it matching your fabric exactly. Again, I've set up my machine following the guide. I've used a flatbed attachment, disengaged the needle because I'm not going to be trimming seam allowances unlike many of the stitches that we'd use for a serger. So to do this stitching, I'm simply going to place the armhole, almost did the neckline, place the armhole area underneath the presser foot area, and align the needles right next to that stitching of the ribbing. And I find it works a little bit better for this decorative stitch if you go a little bit slower, but you don't have to go that slow, and you get very even, neat stitching. And you can see you just kind of continue sewing all the way around the circumference of this. When you finish, get to your starting point, then simply overstitch the area. I'll draw out my threads, cut the threads, and show you what the stitching looks like. Straight on one side, and then on the other side you see the cover stitch. And it's a great way of finishing and top stitching. With a fabric change from Lacoste knit to fleece and just one pattern change, the Sew and Go vest takes on a warmer look, but with a touch of magic. The magic was added by stitching a supersized blanket stitch around the armhole, hem, and hood with fleece yarn. Yarn you make yourself from narrow strips of fleece. Here's how to add magic to your sewing. As I mentioned, this pattern has one change, and that is for the hood. We use the hood pattern that was used earlier in this series when adding a hood to the top pattern. Same thing, but I'm going to show you a different technique of working in the collar and zipper area. And then we'll do this supersized blanket stitching, which is really fun to do, and it's relatively fast because the stitching is so far apart. First of all, the hood. The hood pattern, you'll be cutting 2 of these, and because the hood is larger than the ribbing pattern, you'll need 1 3/8 of the fleece fabric and then about 1/8 of a yard of fleece for the accent. The 2 hood patterns or fabric pieces were stitched right sides meeting around the outer edge of the hood, and now I've started to put this around the neckline. The first step is to put the hood at the neckline as if you were, as we did with so many of the other collar treatments throughout this series. The stay stitching was also a factor here. We stay stitched in this V area or the corner of the collar section and clipped to that V. That's been a kind of a common denominator throughout this program. And then to get the finish around the zipper has been stitched, 1 row stitching in place. We are lining these top 2 lines, the cut edges I should say, and then we wrap the fabric around. I'm going to pin this, and you would sew this, but the pinning should just show you how neatly this finishes the zipper edge. This would be a straight stitch through this area. Let's make it a straight stitch, not a crooked stitch. There we go. And then I will just turn this right side out. And even with pinning, you can see how this finishes the edge, making the zipper flush with the hood area. Whatever amount of the seam allowance was wrapped around to the underside, you'd pin that same consistent amount around the hood and top stitch or cover stitch as we just finished sewing. So that's the way of getting that hood on, using kind of the same basis knowledge but adding a little different dimension. Now for the supersized blanket stitching. For the blanket stitching, I mentioned 1/8 of a yard of fabric is what you'll need, a scrap of fabric, and you're going to be cutting the crosswise, the stretch, the greatest amount of stretch of this fleece, and narrow strips. Test this out. Your kids, if you have kids or grandkids, they love to help with this, especially stretching it. We're just going to cut a narrow strip. 1/4 of an inch is what my staff and I found works well for this. And then make yarn. Doesn't take much to do it. Just pull on it and you have very interesting yarn. And of course, because it's fleece as well, it really works well with, it matches well, coordinates, same type of texture. Then you'll need to thread this into a very large eyed needle, a crewel needle, hand sewing needle with a supersized eye. You might have admired, and my assistant Donna did all the stitching of the blanket stitching around the edge, how evenly it's stitched. Well, we have a way of showing this to you so that you can get equal stitching. And that is with a basting stitch to give you the guideline. And this is with a blind hem stitch. The length is 4.0, a very wide width. Turn under about a 5/8 of an inch hemline and then blanket stitch. Here you can see stitching with a mirrored image stitch around the edge. This will come out a little bit later. After doing this stitching, then simply place the well of the, or the little valley of that stitch, punch a hole with a buttonhole keyhole cutter through that valley. And this will give a little bit of room for that very large fleece yarn. We've started to do the blanket stitching around the lower edge of the sample. Later on you'll pull out this basting stitch, but you place your needle through the slight opening and stitch around the edge. Adjust it and then go to the next stitch, and you'll have a great accent added to your vest. One final tip for this series: when finishing the supersized blanket stitch, remove the basting stitches. I've already pulled out the bobbin thread. And then when connecting the threads, the yarns, you'll have to sew them together with needle and thread. I hope you've enjoyed this series. Bye for now.
Visit Nancy's website at www.sewingwithnancy.com for more information on this program. Sewing with Nancy has been made possible by grants from the following companies: PFAFF, simply the best European line of sewing machines; Ginger Incorporated, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears; Madeira, because creativity is never black and white; Prim Dritz, the source for sewing and quilting notions; Amazing Designs by Great Notions, your one source for home embroidery; Koala cabinets designed with maximum storage using minimum space; and Nancy's Notions catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.